everyone, I'm Rachel Wolfson, the host and founder of Web3 Deep Dive Podcast. Web3 Deep Dive Podcast focuses on real-world Web3 use cases to help you better understand how Web3 is being applied today and how it may be leveraged in the future. If this sounds interesting, I encourage you to subscribe, like, and share the content that you're seeing today to help spread the word about Web3. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Web3 Deep Dive Podcast. Today, I'm excited to announce my next guest. His name is Alex Tapscott. He's an author. He is releasing a book called Web3, Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier. He has many other books, and he is also a co-founder of the Blockchain Research Institute. Hey Alex, how's it going?
Hey Rachel, I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. So Alex, before we get started, how about you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, sure. Well, where to begin? So I started my career in traditional finance, what they call TradFi these days. I was working in investment banking and capital markets for many years. And it was in that role, actually, that I first learned about Bitcoin back in 2013, I think. But it wasn't really until 2014 that I started to pay close attention to it. Of course, this was well before, the words blockchain or Web3 certainly had entered the vernacular. There was this, one new asset, and I think people were trying to make heads and tails of it. The more I looked into it in that period, though, the more convinced I became that this was, more than just a new kind of asset, something you could trade and make money on, but it was actually something that was ushering in maybe a new era for technology. That blockchain, the underlying technology of Bitcoin, was a new digital medium for value that could be used to program anything of value, not just Bitcoin, but other kinds of assets, including, by the way, securities, which was the thing that I was primarily working in at the time. And, so I was just doing this kind of part-time looking into it, and it was actually on a ski trip with my dad in 2014 in Mont-Tremblant in Quebec, over a ribeye steak and a bottle of red wine, that we started to talk a little bit about this stuff. It just so happened that at the same time he was doing his own investigation into Bitcoin through this program he was running at the University of Toronto. And he recruited me to write a report. So while I was still working full-time, I started working on this space. And that report led to other research that we did together. And that research became the basis for a book that we wrote in 2015 called Blockchain Revolution. Now, the way that came about was kind of funny. I was contemplating maybe a career move, and I had a great job at the time, but I was given an offer I couldn't refuse, to do this project. And they say when you're offered a seat on a rocket ship, you don't ask which seat, you just kind of hop on. So I hopped on, and the book came out in 2016. They say that luck is the combination of preparation and good timing. So, we'd written what I thought was a good book, but we also benefited from great timing. 2016 was right around the time that a lot of people in business and media and the arts and journalism and government and many other parts of the world were really trying to understand what blockchains were, what should they care, were they important to their lives. And this was the first book really to describe it to that kind of an audience. So since then, I've done tons of things in the space. I've been an investor, I've been an advisor, I've been a portfolio manager. Right now, in fact, I have an ETF called the Web3 Innovators Fund, which trades on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And I've done a lot of writing on this subject. And for the last year and a half, I've been writing a new book, as you pointed out in your introduction, called Web3, Charting the Internet's Next Economic and Cultural Frontier. That book is coming out in September 19th from HarperCollins, and I'm really excited about it.
Cool. So Alex, can you tell us a little bit about how would you define Web3?
Sure. Well, the Web3 is the internet's next economic and cultural frontier, and Web3 is what follows from Web2. So it's helpful to understand kind of what came before we can talk about the new frontier. So Web1, what I think a lot of people remember as the .com era, and took place primarily during the 1990s, was really a broadcast medium. It was a way to present information digitally. So you used to go online, well, we still do, but you go online to a desktop computer, you go into a browser, you log into a website, and it's on this website that you can access information. And a lot of the early examples of Web 1 websites, the most successful, in many respects kind of resembled what came before. They were kind of like, magazines and newspapers online. So you could access, the sports scores, the classifieds, the news. You could go into Britannica online. You could access information. In design terms, that's what they call skeuomorphic design, where a lot of the new thing resembles the old thing, in part because it's a bridge for users to not feel like they're doing something super foreign, but also because the people who create it can't really imagine anything else. And that's kind of how the dot-com era progressed for a period of time. In the early 2000s, the combination of some new user behavior and new technology led to the creation of a new web, Web 2. So in computer jargon, if Web 1 was the read web, a way to access information, then Web 2 is what they call the read-write web, which means not only is the web a way to access information, but it's a way to communicate, to collaborate, to upload your own content, to build value collectively using the internet. And so a lot of the early promise of Web 2 basically posited that we could all gather together, and through mass collaboration and the wisdom of the crowds, we could create new kinds of organizations and new capability and new value online. And to a degree, Rachel, that happened. But what also happened was all of this user attention and user data and time online ended up getting aggregated into a handful of very powerful platforms who used all that data to basically sell advertising back to users. And in the process, they created walled gardens that were difficult to exit, and in many respects actually stifled the innovation of the open web. So now the web is entering a new era, Web 3, the read, write, own web. So not only is the web a way to access information, not only is it a tool for us to publish and to share content, but it's now a new platform for us to own digital assets. And that means owning our financial assets, owning the virtual assets that we buy from companies, including inside of game environments, but also more profoundly owning our own data and owning our own identities, and being able to decide how that information is used and whether we can take it with us from platform to platform and service to service. And this new ownership web has the promise, holds the promise, in my opinion, to kind of rewrite the economic power grid and to change business and society in some really profound and unexpected ways. And I think, like all prior eras of the web, it's going to be foundational for business, and it's going to usher in new winners, and it's going to make losers of companies that fail to embrace this new paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you said some really interesting things there. Businesses, so basically, let's break that down a little bit. Businesses will start incorporating Web3, and if they don't, they'll fall behind. So Alex, are we already seeing businesses today incorporate Web3, and if so, what are they doing?
Well, it's a great question, and the answer is yes, but to varying degrees. There was a report out from Coinbase just a couple of days before we recorded this podcast that said that half of all Fortune 100 companies were doing something in Web3. But the something, differs a lot from company to company, right? But I think what we are seeing is a lot of companies understanding that, this is potentially a new powerful technology platform that will allow them to access new markets or create new kinds of products or to tap into new kinds of customers that weren't previously possible. And we could talk about many of them. I mean, I think of companies like Nike, for example, a company that has excelled in celebrating creators and athletes through branded merchandise and shoes and so forth. Seeing NFTs and digital assets as a kind of new frontier for connecting with fans and connecting with consumers. So they bought a company called Artifact a couple of years ago, and then recently launched their .swoosh initiative. And they've hired some incredible people to build out that platform. And in a way, it makes sense. Things like Nike shoes. If you're wearing a new pair of Air Jordans, you're wearing it for a lot of reasons. One, you might objectively, you might like the shoe. It might be comfortable, but also you're trying to sort of celebrate Michael Jordan. You love Michael Jordan, and you're also trying to project a certain kind of image to your peer group. Now, increasingly, Gen Zs and other young people are spending more and more of their time online, and a bigger share of their personal self-worth and the way in which they sort of identify themselves is through their digital self, not just their physical self. So it makes sense that a company that traffics in projections of self would want to also look at this new frontier online as a way to do that. Another one is Starbucks. Starbucks is a company that has done major work in this area in its loyalty point scheme. So, Starbucks is a loyalty point program and a financial services company masquerading as a coffee shop, right? Like its loyalty program, its Starbucks points system is one of the most robust loyalty systems in the world. And Starbucks sees an opportunity to use tokens as a way to offer a richer array of benefits and rewards and experiences to people who are using their platform. Now, just because those companies are doing that doesn't mean every company is so inclined, but increasingly we're seeing a lot of companies and enterprises experimenting with what I would describe as the Web3 toolkit. So the Web3 toolkit, includes is basically made up of like tokens, right? Digital assets, and those can be tokens that are on the margin, not really material to their business, or they can be something that's really profound. So a lot of brands in the couture brands and a lot of consumer-facing brands are looking at digital assets as a way to explore Web3's new boundless frontier.
Those are good use cases that you mentioned, Starbucks and Nike. But my question is, because I want our listeners to really understand the difference between tokens and points that, Starbucks today, you go in and you get points and you can use those points towards coffees or whatever on your next visit. But now we're seeing token rewards. So what's the difference between that and what we're seeing today with points?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can think of a token as basically a container for value, in the same way that a website is a container for information. So a website can contain, newspaper, classifieds, it could be a storefront, it could be encyclopedia, it could be a social network, whatever. A token is the same thing. So a token is a programmable thing that can be programmed to contain anything of value. But it has different properties from virtual assets like loyalty reward points, for example. One is ownership. So when you own a token, it means that you hold that token, you custody it, and you can transfer it peer-to-peer. You have the ability to move and store and manage that token. You also have the ability to participate in the growth or decline in the value of that token based on how it's priced in the free market. And that is a very different prospect from traditional assets. We spend about $100 billion a year on virtual goods that we don't actually own. So when you or your children or your cousins or your nieces or nephews or whatever, buy virtual goods inside of games like Roblox or Fortnite, or even when they buy content online, they're purchasing that thing. There's clearly a transaction happening, but you don't own it. You don't have property rights to the digital asset. You're subject to the whims of the company that's issued it to you. So in the case of content, oftentimes a provider like Apple might change its terms of service, and so all of a sudden your ownership of assets, music or what have you, can change. In the case of video game, if that video game studio gets sold to someone else, they may not honor the value of that asset. And in the case of loyalty points, to bring it back to Starbucks, there is a central bank of Starbucks which can decide how much a point is worth, and they can choose to devalue those points without any recourse. So without ownership and without the governance that comes with owning something, you are beholden to whoever's issued that token. Now, that's nothing wrong with that. Like, loyalty point schemes are fine. They work well. But there's a whole new kind of opportunity set when you think about tokens as assets that you can own and custody, that you can move peer to peer, and that are priced in a marketplace. I mean, you can imagine, in the case of Nike, buying an NFT of an Air Jordan that's a one of one, and then that becoming very valuable, just like the first pair of Air Jordans became very valuable, and all of a sudden you're participating in a really live, active marketplace. And so that's, to me, those are the big difference. Tokens are peer to peer, they're self-custodial, they are fungible, which means you can trade them, and they're priced in an open market, which means their value can go up and down. None of those things is true for something like a loyalty point, for example.
Right, yeah. I mean, yeah, you make very good points. I'm just wondering if this concept will catch on with the mainstream. For instance, if you go into Starbucks and you have your loyalty points and you are unable to find them or access them, a Starbucks employee can usually help. But with tokens, I feel like, the self-custody, you have to be responsible for that. There are aspects where ownership is great, but then there are also things where I can see people who are not in the cryptocurrency industry already being a little bit hesitant? And also, where do they store those points? I'm curious to know, Alex, in your new book, did you interview anyone working with Starbucks or Nike to talk about these use cases?
We did. We talked to a lot of people for the book, I think 60 people in total, including a lot of people who are working in the enterprise world with companies like Nike and with Starbucks. And what they would say is that those companies don't know the answer to that question yet. And I think that that's something that sounds disappointing maybe, but in a way it's very commonplace for new kinds of technology. Oftentimes the thing when a new technology emerges is that for existing customers or people that traditionally frequent a business, the new technology makes the thing actually less useful, right? So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. For a lot of enterprises that were relying on mini computers and mainframe computers, when the first PCs came along, they were considered not very useful for business. They were slow, they were small, they didn't have the same kind of computing power as much bigger computers did. When the very first Japanese motorcycles came to the United States, they were derided for being kind of powerless and not fast and not suitable for highway driving. And so a lot of motorcycle enthusiasts didn't purchase them. So a lot of times when a new technology comes along, the existing market actually finds it to be less useful. But what ends up happening is that typically to begin with, a small group of early enthusiasts finds that the very thing that the most of the market thought was not useful is actually the thing that they think is really great, right? So, in the case of the motorcycles, well, those bikes were great for off-roading, and actually the introduction of Japanese motorcycles led to an explosion in the motorcycle market, where all of a sudden within a decade or two, 10, 20 times as many motorcycles were being sold because of the introduction of motocross and off-roading. In the case of the PC, the PC led to a revolution of personal computing where people realized that the computer was a thing you could keep inside of your home and that you could use it for more than data processing. It was a tool for education and for communication and so much more than that. And that led to the PC revolution. And in the case of crypto assets, the fact that self-custody might appear to be a bug for some, the concern about holding these assets and will this ever go mainstream, is for a lot of other people actually one of its big superpowers. So for a lot of people in the world who don't have access to financial services or who live in a country where the currency is unreliable, the ability to hold something of value, in a way that you can take it with you on your device, that allows you to sell it or move it peer to peer, that is the superpower. Now, it may not be suitable for everyone, but that initial group of users, oftentimes the least profitable, least lucrative group of users, incidentally, is the one that finds it the most useful. And ultimately, if that use case can scale, and if people consider it to be, a benefit, then you can start to see it spread to the rest of the market. And there's plenty of evidence for this. So I gave you a couple of examples of that, of how something new, which is initially considered not mainstream, can actually help to overtake the mainstream. I think it's very possible that we see that with tokens as well. Now, I wish I'd come up with this concept. I should credit, this is from Clay Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma, those two examples about motorcycles and PCs. But it's this idea that incumbent businesses, legacy companies, often have a hard time embracing innovation because the most rational thing to do is to focus on your core business and to focus on your core customers, not to experiment with something that is new and not yet proven in the market. And this is kind of a perfect example of that, Rachel. Tokens, as you rightly pointed out, are something that maybe people in the crypto community might think is really cool, but will mainstream people ever pick it up? And so when I said the people that are working with those companies are not sure how those companies feel about it, I think that's sincere. I think at this point in the evolution of the technology, you've got to have some humility about how all of this is going to proceed. But what I can tell you is that the companies today that are working on this are the ones that are going to be succeeding in commercializing it in the future. In the 1990s, there were a bunch of companies that people pointed to as being big, great investments, right? So companies that had solid businesses, great customers, moats, all the rest, companies like Borders and Barnes and Noble and J.C. Penney and Macy's and Kodak and Polaroid and all these companies. So, all of those companies had something in common, which is that they were about to be disrupted in some way by the first era of the web, by the read web. The read web was a medium for the presentation of information, and all of those businesses were in the information industry, right? And so information industry companies became disrupted. So today we have to look at the world and say, with a Web 1 lens, then we use a Web 3 lens today and say, what are the companies today that may appear to be strong, with good defenses and good customers and so forth, but are actually standing on a burning platform and where they're about to be disintermediated or disrupted by the Internet of Value and Web3. And I'm not sure what all those companies are. I mean, I think about it a lot, but I think you've got to be diligent and vigilant in the face of this kind of profound change.
Mm-hmm, definitely. So I want to talk a little bit about your book, because when I think of Web3, I mainly think of blockchain technology, but there's more to it. And actually, I just interviewed your dad, Don Tapscott, who went into a whole spiel about all the elements of Web3. So I wanted to ask you, what are the technology elements of Web3? And is blockchain kind of like the primary technology, or is it a combination of these technologies?
It's a great question. I think blockchain is the foundational technology for Web3 and for the second era of the digital age. I think that right now we talk about all these new technologies, generative AI, the Internet of Things, virtual and augmented reality, new sources of computing and power generation. And we view them as all discrete, distinct things. But I think over time, we're going to find that they collectively make up the foundational technologies for the new web and for the second digital age. In the same way that, technologies like computing, mobility, telephony, software, hardware, et cetera, together collectively kind of congealed into what we consider to be like the internet age, right? So I do agree with my dad in that respect, which is that these technologies, while distinct, are deeply intertwined in how they're going to change the world. I look at Web3, I look at blockchains as sort of like the foundational layer for this new era. Because if we can imagine a world where there are trillions of connected devices, AI agents, autonomous AI agents, smart contracts, countless organizations, including new kinds of organizations like DAOs, all in the world needing to prove their identity, or in the case of people, prove their humanness, to create trust, to transact, to move and store value, to organize capability. It's not going to be with existing financial rails provided by banks or with existing technology platforms. We need a new operating system for the digital age. And so that's what I view as the promise of Web3.
Yeah,
and of blockchains in particular. Now, specifically within Web3, there are several other technologies which are worth pointing out. So blockchains are the foundational layer. Well, then you've got smart contracts, which is how we organize intelligence into transactions. We have zero knowledge proofs, which is how we can program not only privacy but scalability. We have new kinds of primitives like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, which create ways for people around the world to self-organize and to pool capital in order to build something, which is something that is also very new. So all of these different kind of protocols and primitives are kind of congealing together into this new thing. And I think in the same way that we might look back on the first sort of internet era as encompassing many technologies, I think we're going to feel the same way about Web3.
Definitely. I also think I want to shift gears a little bit because we recently saw the Ripple XRP court ruling, and the judge, Annalise Torres, said, or she ruled, that the XRP token is not a security when it's sold on digital asset exchanges. So that was a win for the industry. Do you think that is going to also push forward adoption of blockchain technology and businesses may wanting to start exploring tokens of their own? Do you think that that's going to impact this at all?
I think that decision alone won't move the needle, but I think that decision might start a process that leads to a new framework for the industry. Ultimately, big businesses, well, all businesses, don't really like to innovate in a regulatory vacuum. Some do. I mean, this is a frontier. I use the frontier analogy a lot. And of course, there are plenty of people and companies who have built a lot of value in Web3 and in crypto by pushing forward even when the rules were far from clear, despite their pleading to regulators that they clarify. But when it comes to like big enterprises and big companies, they need to understand the rules of the road before they, enter into any kind of multi-year investment cycle into some new business line or new product offering to customers. And this is actually a very specific thing. We have a researcher on our faculty who does tons of other things, but her name is Primavera de Filippi, and she wrote this really great report for the BRI where she described the regulatory vacuum phenomenon. And in the midst of a regulatory vacuum, economic progress is impeded. So I think we're right now, my point is only to say that, for a while, we've been innovating in a vacuum, and that's okay when it's early. But now that this is big business, we need clarity on these issues. Starbucks is not going to, go further down the path on tokens if they find out that they've been, doing an unregistered securities offering when they're just trying to build value for their customers, right? So we need to have clarity on these issues. The Torres ruling was significant, in my opinion, because it drew a very important distinction between digital assets or crypto assets as they exist, in the world as things that have utility or value and trade peer-to-peer versus, an initial sale of an asset in order to build, a new business or something. Those are distinct things, and I think that was a really important thing for them to point out. But it doesn't clarify the rules, and if anything, like 2 weeks later, I think, or 3 weeks later, there was a separate ruling where a judge didn't overturn that, but simply posited that, well, maybe that's not true. Well, maybe that's not necessarily something we should agree to. So, there's I wouldn't say competing legal arguments, but I would say that there's a lot of confusion, and that, if more than anything, creates the conditions to build out a new rule set. And look, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, as they say. In other words, like, if there is a new set of rules around this asset class and this industry, it's not going to make everybody happy all at once. But any kind of framework is better than none at this point. We've seen, in a lot of parts of the world, like the Michael laws in Europe, or even some clarifications on this in Hong Kong and Singapore, have really helped to give industry comfort to innovate there. And I think that right now, I think a lot of people in industry feel like they're standing on quicksand in the U.S. So figuring out a way to create a level playing field and a solid foundation, I think, is going to be really important.
Definitely. I also thought it was interesting that, well, it was just a few days ago from today, and obviously when this podcast comes out, we're going to be a few weeks into this, but the SEC told Coinbase, or was that true? I don't know if it was true. The SEC told Coinbase only to list Bitcoin. I don't know if that was a rumor or if that was actually true, but I think that
Brian Armstrong said it. So the CEO of Coinbase told the press. So I mean, I don't think he's lying. I'm sure they did tell him that. I don't see any reason why he would say that if it weren't true.
Right.
And if true, assuming it is true, it to me it reveals that, well, at least in their case, they don't see any distinction between any of these assets really, other than Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So there's still so much that we have to watch and wait for to see how the regulatory environment in the United States will shape up for digital assets. And, like you said, that's going to impact the entire industry, and it will impact the innovation here in the United States, at least.
Certainly, yeah. And, what's interesting, I guess, this time is that obviously the U.S. is hugely important to the future of any new technology. And I think that that's certainly true for Web3. But things are a bit different than they were, 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, there was a time when people considered Silicon Valley almost a bit of a tech Galapagos. That's an expression coined by a person whose name I can't remember right now. But the idea of the tech Galapagos is basically, there's a unique set of conditions. There's capital, there's government R&D, the university network, There is, a culture of entrepreneurship. There's a VC industry. There are other big companies full of employing lots of technologists. And all of these unique conditions led to the creation of a special species of tech founder that could only be found in one single place, just like the turtles of Galapagos or whatever. And that led to the creation of the big internet companies. Well, to be sure, like San Fran and Silicon Valley definitely still have a strong case to make about that. But those conditions exist elsewhere as well. In the early 90s, as the first era of the internet was being commercialized, most of the world's population had never made a phone call. And now 2/3 of the world's population has access to a supercomputer in this form of a smartphone connected to the internet. So, technology, tools, capital, talent, et cetera, are more distributed than ever. And then the second thing is that this technology itself lends itself to global collaboration, to decentralization. You don't necessarily need to be anywhere in order to participate in this. And I think in a way that's a really positive thing. They say that technology is a steamroller, technology is flattens the world. Well, if that's true, then I think Web3 will be a steamroller. That's an expression I'm still trying to nail down. But anyway, but it's going to flatten things out. It's going to make it easier to move value, store value, earn assets, and so forth. And so going back to your initial question, does the U.S. need to do this? Yes, they do, but not for the sake of Web3. They need to do it for their own sake. Because if they don't get it right, then this is just going to happen somewhere else. It's not that it's a matter of it happening or not. It's a matter of it happening in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure you have lots of insights because you are the co-founder of the Blockchain Research Institute as to where innovation is happening in the world. I've been told that a lot of innovation is happening in Asia in terms of adopting Web3 technology. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see a particular region adopting faster than others?
I think so. The data shows that adoption of tokens and a lot of Web3 applications, such as gaming, are occurring in parts of the world that one might not expect is an area of tech innovation. Countries like Thailand or Vietnam or Nigeria or Venezuela. But what a lot of those countries have in common is that there are plenty of young people there. The populations of those countries are way younger on average than they are in places like the U.S. and certainly more so than in Europe, where the average age is 60. But also those are places in the world where people are kind of underemployed or willing to hustle or to learn in order to earn a living and make some money. And so there have been opportunities for people to plug into the Web3 economy and earn some money, and if you know how to do it. And maybe you're not willing to go through all that, learning if you live in comfort in Denmark or something, but you might be more willing to do it if you're a young enterprising and entrepreneurial entrepreneurial is a
Say
new
that
word
3 times fast,
yeah,
Alex.
what was that? Anyway, so, you're an enterprising young person in one of these countries, you might take a crack at it. So that's on the user side. And then on the business and innovation side, I think it's probably overstated how ahead or how open, Asian companies are to this, frankly. I think when I think of, which businesses are doing the most in Web3, I think it's, first of all, I think most companies haven't really taken the full leap yet in general, on the big enterprise side. But if I look at the membership of the Blockchain Research Institute, for example, as an indicator of that, we have companies from all around the world. We have one of our most active and most innovative members is Standard Bank, which is based in Africa. But we also, count companies like FedEx as members who are based in the United States. So I would say that enterprises generally are curious about this, are doing really interesting work, but it's still very early.
Yeah, definitely. You bring up good points. And actually, I heard FedEx is starting to use blockchain technology. I should be at an event in a few weeks called Rare Evo, and I think they've got someone from FedEx there who hopefully I'll get to interview for this podcast. So stay tuned, listeners. I'm curious to know what FedEx is doing with blockchain.
Yeah.
But it's very hopeful to see these enterprises starting to utilize the technology.
Yeah, well, one of the projects that I think is really interesting that I talk about in the new book is a project called Hive Mapper. So yeah, you should check that out and maybe have the CEO on the show at some point. His name's Ari. So he was with Yahoo Maps back in the early 2000s, back when mapping online was pretty early stage. And at the time, Yahoo had a big market share, but within a year or two, Google had kind of overtaken them. And Google had become basically the dominant mapping player in the world. And we think of that as mostly a consumer-facing application. You go online, you go into Google Maps. But actually, Google makes a lot of its money by licensing its mapping data to third parties, so governments or rental car companies or other corporations that use that mapping data. And so what? Like it's a company, it's got mapping data. Well, there's an opportunity for in Hive Mapper's case, to build something that is a sort of more of an open commons, something that anybody can access. And they do this in this really inventive way, which is basically you can buy a dash cam, you can put it in your car, and you can map streets. And in exchange for mapping those streets, you get access to a token, which is paid to you, and basically gives you sort of a say in the governance and the outcome of Hive Mapper as a whole. And they've already mapped most of the streets in several major metro areas, and they would say they've mapped more than 1% of all the roads in the world. Now, the difference between Google Maps and this is that people with Hive Mapper dash cams are constantly driving around all over town, constantly creating new content, new data that gets uploaded. And so a map that is comprised of information piled in by everyone can actually be more useful, more accurate, more up to date than something that a single company can do. But the only way that you can do that is by creating an incentive, creating an ownership incentive that encourages people to participate in this. And so that's the missing piece. There was a project called Waze. You probably have used Waze.
Yeah, I remember
before,
Waze.
right?
Yep.
So Waze is bought by Google for like $1.2 billion. Waze was actually successful largely because of an army of volunteers that all helped to chip in to help refine its mapping data, improve its maps, and so forth. And when Hive Mapper got sold to Google for $1.2 billion, the people who did all this volunteer work, these cartophiles as they're called, actually didn't get to participate in any of the upside from that because they weren't owners, right? So basically the idea is if everyone's going to be chipping in and doing work and helping to contribute to something useful and valuable, then maybe they should participate in the upside. Anyway, I was reminded of that just because I think of a company like FedEx or UPS or Uber or really anyone. These are all companies that rely hugely on Google's APIs and on its mapping data to be able to have an alternative that's maybe more accurate, could be really, really valuable. And not only that, like a company like FedEx is got more trucks on the road than almost any other fleet owner on the planet, and so they could be out there mapping the world on behalf of Hive Mapper and building their own mapping system rather than relying on a third party. So anyway, it's just one of these interesting areas where in Web3 I think people think of gaming and finance and the metaverse, and to be sure, these are all areas that I think are really fascinating, digital assets being sort of foundational to all three of those industries, but also this idea of ownership being an incentive that can drive collaboration is something that can be applied to all industries, and in this case to what I would argue is physical infrastructure. Mapping data is part of the infrastructure for our connected world.
Yeah, that's such a great use case. I'm really excited to read your book. And especially now with that use case being in there, I want to learn more about it. I would love to connect with Ari as well. Do you know if Hive Mapper is that used in the United States, or is it used in a particular region at the moment?
So I think the last time I spoke to him, he said the big cities that have been mapped the most are Seoul, LA, and New York City. So there are a lot of Hive mappers in the States, that's for sure.
Cool. And then I wanted to also point something out that was also interesting because, we're talking about FedEx and UPS. Recently, and I'm not 100% sure why, but UPS was on a strike, right, in the United States?
Yeah.
I don't know.
The workers
at UPS were on a strike. I got a message saying your package might not be delivered because they're on a strike, and I was concerned. I don't know. I'm assuming it has something to do with economic issues. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know why they were on a strike. But Alex, you said something really that resonated with me. If UPS had an incentive system built in where their workers could map their route and then get some sort of an incentive like a UPS token, that kind of solves that problem of them being underpaid or whatever the reason was why they were on strike. So that's a great use case.
Yeah, that's actually something I hadn't thought of, which is there could be a profit share or an economics share with the drivers as part of like a collective bargaining agreement where they get to own a piece of that platform too, since they're already doing the work, right?
Right. And I mean, I think that's where a lot of these issues that we're seeing today with people going on strike, and it's happening everywhere, airlines and deliveries, and it's just people don't feel like they own what they're doing, and they're not being incentivized in the way that they should be. Mm-hmm. And now we've got AI coming up, and that, people are saying that's going to start replacing human jobs. It's like we've really got to solve these issues to make people feel like they're valuable. And I think Web3 does that.
Yeah.
Or can do it. It has the potential to do it.
Well, it has the potential to do it. And then this is another question which is interesting to ponder, which is, is it going to be UPS and Apple and FedEx and, other big corporations? These are all great companies, obviously. Are they the ones that are going to embrace these kinds of, I would argue, almost radical kinds of ideas? Or is it going to be something new that comes along where they don't have the legacy, the culture, the infrastructure to do it? I personally think that, companies like FedEx could do it. We work really closely with FedEx. They're amazing, innovative. Fred Smith, who built FedEx, is someone who, would argue from day zero, they've been a computer logistics company, and it's all about building systems that work. And he's a huge fan of blockchain. But I also think we're going to see a lot of innovation coming from startups, from founders who don't have that installed base and don't have that legacy, culture, whatever it is, and can do something new. We'll see. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, we'll see, exactly. Alex, we're going to start wrapping things up here. So do you have any projects in the works that you want our listeners to know about, or do you want to say anything about your book, or just things that you're looking forward to in general before we say goodbye?
Well, I'm really looking forward to the fall and to the launch of the new book, which comes out on September 19th, and it's available for pre-order. I would say that I'm really looking forward to resetting the conversation about Web3. I think that recent events and some common misconceptions have thrown fresh mud on the windshield and really kind of skewed the perspective for a lot of people about what this technology is and isn't, what it can and cannot do. And my hope is that this book helps to clarify, to wipe that mud off the windshield and give people a better picture. Ultimately, I view, Web3 as an economic and cultural frontier, and that's why I called the book, Web3. The internet's next economic and cultural frontier. And frontiers have their fair share of opportunities, but they also have their fair share of risks. And they attract the brightest people and they attract the bravest people, but they also attract your fair share of sharp-elbowed hustlers and criminals and ne'er-do-wells and the rest of it. And so, I think that with humility, no matter how hardy an explorer you are, you need a guide to help you explore and navigate this frontier. And I hope that my book can do that. So I encourage people to check it out. It's available for pre-order anywhere that you buy books. I've got a bunch of links to stores on my website, alextapscott.com. So check it out.
Cool. Well, I'm definitely going to read it, and I'm excited just, to stay in touch with you because you always seem to have a book coming out. So I'm curious to know what your next book is going to be after, this book that you wrote about Web3. So I'm going to definitely be on the lookout for that because it seems like you and also your dad, Don, are always ahead of the game here with technology.
Well, we do our best, We like to say the future is not something to be predicted. It's something to be achieved. But at the same time, when you're looking over the horizon, it's helpful to have a guide, as I said earlier. So that's what we hope the books do. Not predict the future, but help people to navigate it if they can.
Yeah, wonderful. Alex, what is your Twitter handle if our listeners want to get in touch with you on Twitter?
Oh, of course, yeah, at Alex Tapscott. Post about stuff. Also have a podcast. You can all check all that stuff out on my Twitter account.
Cool. Okay. Well, we will. Thanks, Alex.
Okay, thanks, Rachel.
Special thanks to Aaron Bender for producing Web3 Deep Dive podcast. I'd also like to thank the sponsors behind Web3 Deep Dive. Finally, thanks to the listeners for tuning in. Please be sure to subscribe, like, and share. I'll see you guys next time.